The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 remains one of the most intense confrontations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and marked the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev thought President Kennedy was weak, an impression seemingly confirmed during the Berlin Crisis of 1961, as well as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. In July 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly made an agreement with Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro to deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. This move was intended to counter U.S. nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy and deter any invasion attempts by the U.S. By late summer 1962, the Soviets began constructing missile sites in Cuba, and on September 4th, President Kennedy issued a public warning against the introduction of weapons into Cuba. On October 14th, Strategic Air Command U-2 spy planes captured photos indicating Soviets had introduced bombers and medium-range missiles into Cuba. Once operational, these missiles could carry a 2.3 megaton thermonuclear warhead capable of striking targets across most of the continental U.S. and reach Washington, D.C. in just 13 minutes. Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22nd and announced a naval blockade of Cuba. He made it clear that any missile launched from Cuba would be seen as an attack by the Soviet Union, triggering a full U.S. retaliatory response. At the same time, the U.S. military was put on DEFCON 3. The next day, U.S. Navy tactical reconnaissance jets discovered that Soviet missiles had become operational. In response, General Thomas Power, SAC commander, raised readiness to DEFCON 2. B-52 bombers began continuous airborne operations. B-47 bombers were dispersed to military and civilian airfields on a 15-minute alert, and all ICBMs were placed on alert. Khrushchev, in response, called the U.S. quarantine an act of aggression and ordered Soviet ships bound for Cuba to proceed. For several tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Then, on October 26th, the Soviet agent reached out to the U.S., offering a potential deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. Unfortunately, the next day, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing pilot Major Rudolph Anderson and threatening to derail the negotiations. After careful consideration, Kennedy chose to respond to the first message, ignoring a second Soviet demand that the U.S. remove its missiles from Turkey. But, through back-channel negotiations, the U.S. secretly assured the Soviets that the missiles would be removed from Turkey. Their removal had already been planned, but this provided an off-ramp to de-escalate the crisis. On October 28th, Khrushchev publicly announced that the Soviet missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and removed, effectively ending the crisis. SAC maintained DEFCON 2 through November 15th, reducing to DEFCON 3 November 21st and DEFCON 4 on November 27th. In early December 1962, President Kennedy flew to Offutt to present a Flight Safety Award to General Power and SAC for their safe performance during the crisis. By April 1963, the U.S. missiles in Turkey were quietly removed as part of the resolution. The Cuban Missile Crisis had several lasting outcomes. A direct link, known as the Hotline, was installed between the White House and the Kremlin to better facilitate communication. Both countries reconsidered the dangers of the nuclear arms race, leading to the first steps toward the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a lasting reminder of the fragile balance of power and the dangers of nuclear weapons.